I may as well dive straight in and talk about our cloud native backup solutions with Veeam Backup for AWS and Microsoft Azure. So the first thing that I want to talk about is what we're actually showing here. And as Anthony's been mentioning about the whole Veeam platform, what we also have available is our cloud native products, which can work standalone or part of the Veeam cloud platform. So when we're talking about cloud native, this question always comes up is, what exactly do you mean by cloud native? Everybody has these different terms and different reasons around what a cloud is, what's cloud native. So in this instance, when I'm talking about cloud native, what I mean is backup solutions that are able to integrate with the individual public cloud providers. So to give you an example, AWS. Now, we've been able to back up AWS instances for a number of years using like agents and those kind of original backup solutions, whether it's Veeam backup for replication or, you know, even good old NT backup if you want to go back though in those days, and just leveraging existing tools. But the challenge with that is how they were able to understand what was going on from a restore perspective. So when I'm talking about cloud native throughout this session, I want everyone just to understand that when I say cloud native, I mean native understanding of the individual public cloud provider, whether that's AWS or Azure. So our backup solutions understand things like AWS EBS snapshots. They understand Azure subscriptions. They understand AWS network security groups, that kind of thing. Now, everything we've done around the cloud is cost effective. Now, it's a bit of a cliche, but we always talk about how expensive the cloud can be. And as our CTO always says, Danny Allen, the cloud is not a charity. We can see that with AWS and Microsoft Azure's revenue numbers. It can get very expensive if you do certain things that you don't fully understand, whether that's pulling data in and out of S3, configuring virtual machines with a ridiculous size, whatever it is that you do in the cloud, you need to understand that there's a cost associated with everything. And that's a fundamental shift for a lot of people from on-prem who've worked there for a long time, because on-prem is just a case of, well, we paid for this hardware. We know what it's going to cost over these 5 years. You implement a solution in the cloud and don't consider the costs, then you can get a bit of a surprise. So everything we do is based around being cost effective, and you'll see how we've built that into the tools as we go through. Security is another aspect, and I'm going to talk in a minute about how we integrate from like an AWS and Azure's security best practices. But everything we've done is to build security into the platforms. And then cloud mobility as well. Being able to take an EC2 instance, go and restore it onto Nutanix, onto vSphere, into Microsoft Azure, wherever you want to move that workload. So with that, when I'm talking about security aspects, one of the AWS best practices is to have multiple AWS accounts, and you leverage those as isolated environments. Much like you create separate clusters and DMZs in an on-prem world, you would create separate accounts for different domains within AWS. So if you think about, like we have here in the pink, production account 1, production account 2, they could be different business units, different departments like HR, finance. They could be different environments like production, staging, dev, test. So in this instance, what we always recommend is to create a separate backup account. So to make sure that you can actually deploy the backup solution in that account, but it also keeps all your data separate. So you have a breach of security in your production account, maybe someone hacks it, goes in and deletes all that data. You can then go and still recover that data because it's in a separate security boundary in a different account. So one of the ways that we look at doing this is around how we implement our solutions. So we deploy an appliance into either an AWS account or an Azure subscription. And everything I'm telling you about Veeam Backup for AWS applies for Veeam Backup for Azure as well. So you would typically set a standard backup policy to go and create like a week's worth of snapshots. Snapshots are great from an RTO perspective. You can recover very quickly in those regions. Then once you have ran your daily backups and created these snapshots, we can actually take a copy of that snapshot, convert it into what we call an OVBK, and offload that into Amazon S3. So S3 is great from a long-term data retention perspective. It's obviously a lot cheaper than having a lot of snapshots keeping around. And it also allows you to leverage storage in different accounts, different regions. So if you think about the best practices of the 3-2-1 rule, that kind of thing. You can then continue taking your snapshots as we go along, and we just continue as normal until the next time, and then we'll take another copy of that snapshot and offload it to S3. Now, what we do to keep the costs down is we leverage things called workers. So workers are really easy. They're just small instances that we spin up in regions to make sure that that data stays in that region. Anyone who's worked with AWS or Azure know as soon as you start copying data out of regions, maybe from say like London to Oregon, then you're going to pay for the data transfer costs. If you keep the data in those regions, regardless of whether it's moving across counts, there's no charge for that. So you'll see as we go along how we spin up some small instances. Yeah, so you have a question, Andy.
Yeah, so that's on from 2 slides ago. You were talking about the identity and access management for each of the production lines. Mm-hmm. First of all, glad to see that because sometimes most backup solutions, they'll try to use them all, muck up into one. But my question is, do you have to use the native cloud IAM solutions, or can you integrate with existing enterprise solutions?
Good question. So from an AWS perspective, we leverage AWS IAM for all the security in AWS. You can create obviously roles and policies to go cross account as well to give different permissions into different environments. In Azure, we leverage native Azure Active Directory, so you can leverage different Active Directories as well. So, but it's all native to the cloud. Everything that's integrated with AWS at the moment. No external third-party security roles or anything like that, or tools, sorry.
So when you set it up, is it a large amount of work to set up them on the cloud?
No, and I'm going to jump into the demo in about 30 seconds, so you'll be able to see how easy it is to configure and how you can do it. So give us a few minutes and we'll come back.
Yeah, more than a configuration itself, the question is more of, am I able to move, if I have the whole enterprise RBAC set up in enterprise side, would I be able to replicate that?
So that is more of a question around AWS and Azure support. So AWS, obviously, most of their security is around identity and access management and the IAM roles. So depending on how you're doing that would depend on how you can integrate with AWS. Azure is a bit different because Azure, obviously, everything out of the box is just integrated with AD, and most large enterprises all use Active Directory, and you just install the connector and off you go. But from an AWS perspective, there's obviously some different challenges around that, but obviously it's a little bit out of scope.
That's exactly the reason for my question. Okay, yeah. Thank you.
So, cool. So just before we dive into the demo, I just want to show kind of what we're actually going to look at here. And this is around doing AWS to AWS backup. So I'm backing up AWS instances, restoring into AWS. We're going to show how you can go from AWS to Azure, and also show you how easy it is to go from like AWS to on-prem, Azure to on-prem, or even vSphere to AWS or Azure, and those kind of things. So we'll recap on this slide. So with that, I'm going to switch over to the demo. And the first thing you see, so we're talking about cloud native with the public cloud providers. Everything that we do here, you can deploy easily from those marketplaces, whether it's the AWS marketplace or the Azure marketplace. Now, I'm not going to dive in and show you how you can deploy something from the marketplace, but it's real simple. You just search for Veeam, and all of Veeam's products that are available to be deployed in the public clouds show up. Once you deploy it, the first thing that you're presented with is a getting started page. So you have the ability to add AWS accounts, configure workers, create your backup repositories in the object storage platforms, and then go and create your first policy. So to get started with backing up your workload, it's literally 4 steps. Now, as I mentioned, talking through the slides, AWS, we have the ability to support multiple AWS accounts. So you can see here, we've got 4 accounts here. These are all based on IAM roles. We have the default backup account. We have a disaster recovery account that I use. I have a production account. You'll actually see a live workload in this demo that runs on my home network. And then I also have a production account for Michael Cade, where we'll see a lot of his workloads as well. So I'm able to not only protect workloads across multiple accounts, but if I was a service provider, I would actually be able to leverage this to provide managed services capabilities to my customers as well. So that'll keep like Jim Jones happy as well. The great thing that we provide is once you add an account, it's really straightforward. You just say add, here's my name, here's the details. You can actually check the permissions. So we'll run through, make sure that you've set up the IAM roles correctly. If you haven't, we have the ability to just grant these. So you can put a temporary access key in there. You just go into AWS IAM and say, go and create these. It will then go and configure that account if you haven't done it correctly, how it's needed. So really simple. Repositories as well are really simple. You just create an object storage bucket in S3 in that region. And then we just say, right, okay, give it a name. What account do I want to use? So again, you can pick different accounts where you want to store your backup data. And then you just pick those repositories. So you can see here that I created one called Veeam Backup for AWS London, and I created a folder. So it's really straightforward. The final thing you have to do to configure our Veeam Backup for public cloud products is configure the workers. So you want to create separate networks for your workers, whether it's you want to create a resource group or put it in a particular availability zone, however you're configuring this. So you just pick your subnets, pick your security group so you can make sure it's all locked down. So from an enterprise perspective and anyone using the public cloud, you can manage the security around this. Once it's configured, you simply go and create a policy. Now, our policies have a number of options in them, and I'm actually going to edit this one so you can see what's going on. If I can move my Zoom stuff. Zoom's getting in the way of everything. There we are. So what we can see here is the first thing you do is you obviously give it a name, and then we move to our sources. So we can pick, again, those different AWS accounts, so we can go and protect resources in whatever account that we want to have, whether it's production, disaster recovery, staging, wherever it is. We also have the ability to recheck permissions. We can pick any or all of the regions, whether it's AWS or Azure, we can pick them. For this instance, I'm just picking some resources in Oregon. We then pick what we want to back up. Do we want to protect an instance or leverage tags? So if we're doing a lot of automation, that kind of thing. We spoke about tags in the public cloud across a number of tech field days, how good they are from an automation perspective. We can pick like individual instances, or I can actually protect all resources in that region. Now I do it individually because you can see here, I have a number of like Kubernetes workloads running as well through like managed EKS services in AWS. I don't want to back those up because they're not important to me. But I have one workload that's really important to me, and it's this unified controller. So I have this in a platinum policy. This runs my whole home network. And obviously, the world we live in now, if my network at home goes down, then my wife's going to cause chaos because Netflix isn't going to work. The final thing we can do is turn application-aware processing on. So if we want to do things like VSS, that kind of thing in Windows, we can actually do application-aware snapshots as well. We then move on to our target. So what do we want to do? Where do we want to store our backups? We have the ability to replicate snapshots across regions. So if we want to take a backup of this workload that's running in London, I can replicate this across to not only another region, but we see that I'm actually replicating it to Ohio, and I'm replicating it into a separate account. So again, from a security perspective, what that gives me is it gives me another copy of a snapshot, and it stores it in a separate account, so that not only am I storing my backup data in a separate account, I have my production workloads in another account. I now have a replicated snapshot in another account. So that 3-2-1 rule comes in again, where we have 3 copies of that data across 2 media types with at least 1 off-site. Now, I have lots of media types from object storage, from snapshots, and I have them in different regions as well. The final thing we do is we go and pick our backup repository. So our object storage, our S3 bucket or an Azure Blob storage bucket. So here we are, I'm picking Oregon. I'm picking the same region because I want to keep my costs down and I don't want to be copying lots of backup data around. We now come to our scheduling. Now, we have this is Veeam Backup for AWS. This is our latest version, and we brought in what we call harmonized scheduling. So we can actually say, when do we want to take a snapshot? When do we want to take a replica? And when do we want to take a backup? So we can actually control the costs down to, if I take a snapshot at 12 o'clock, I want to use that snapshot for my replica and I want to use it for my backup. Or as you can see here, I want to use my 12 o'clock snapshot for my replica, but I'm going to take a snapshot at 10 p.m. and then use that for my backups. So depending on what you pick here, totally depends on how you impact your backup costs.
Speaking of cost, it looks like when you're making changes to this policy, here we go. So you've got these are these are estimated costs.
Yes. So we have this cost estimator that it's very dynamic. So we can see here that my monthly cost for this one workload is $4.77. This is based on AWS or Azure list prices. So if there's like loads of discounts and stuff, it won't reflect that. But based on the Azure list prices and the AWS list prices, this is what it's going to cost you for this backup policy per month. Now, if I go in here and actually turn this off, it gets more expensive based on the number of snapshots I'm taking. So we can see that my cost has just gone up. So depending on how I configure this, if I take a snapshot every hour and do a backup every hour, we're going to see significant costs. If I have a lot of workloads in here, we'll see this more expensive. So from a configuration perspective, this gives us a lot of granular control over what we're doing. Because the last thing you want to do is have a nice little VM running. Like, I think this VM cost me like $3-4 a week to run. If I go and spend $50 a month on a backup, that's not really what I'm trying to do here. So it gives us that ability to manage those costs and understand what's going on.
Do you also have a summary of all the, a kind of report with everything that you are backing up?
Yeah. So when we get to the end of the wizard, if you want to call it that, we have this summary page that shows you, this is what I've called it. Have I enabled snapshots? Am I copying tags? What's my policies? Where am I replicating it to? So we break it all down right at the end, so you can just look at this.
David, quick question on the cost features there. So you said that you have them tied to the native list costs.
Yeah.
But we know in the cloud, those costs can change randomly as time goes on. So is that something dynamic where you're also? It is
dynamic, yeah.
Current?
When we get to the cost estimation page, we actually pull the prices. So we randomly sync it as well. So obviously you're not sat there waiting for us to pull all AWS's prices down, because they do seem to change them every day. But yes, it's not, oh, I've deployed Veeam Backup for AWS and 2 years later it's showing the same prices. It's dynamic, it changes on the fly. So once we have our policies running, what we have is our protected instances. So this shows you where all our backups are protected. And we can see here that based on the policies, I have these workloads in a policy, but you can also see these aren't assigned to policies. Now, because I have access to Michael's production account, he actually just has some backup set up with Snapshots. He's actually he has his own Veeam backup for AWS. He takes snapshots with those. I can use those to restore here as well. So it's very dynamic, the ability to just detect the snapshots across these backups. We have a number of ways that we can actually go and do restores. So if I click on a restore point, we can see that like these ones, for example, they're just all snapshots. If I go up to my Unify controller, we can see that I have a remote snapshot, a local snapshot, and then I've got data in my backup repositories as well. So I'm able to go and do a restore, whether I want to go do a restore in the same account, different regions, or whatever.
David, I have a question regarding the snapshots. Are these snapshots using the native EBS snapshots, or are these Veeam specific snapshots?
No, they're native snapshots to AWS and Azure. So they're EBS snapshots and Azure snapshots.
Okay, so you're not using an agent inside the EC2 instance. Okay, so if I want to get crash consistent or application consistent snapshots, I would need to use something slightly different.
Yeah, so when we use application aware, we leverage the AWS agent that's in the Windows environment to go and run VSS, for example. But when we're just doing the crash consistent snapshots, they're all just called through the AWS or Azure APIs. Good question.
Okay. The other question I have is, this is all very EC2 instance centric or VM centric. But obviously AWS has, I don't know, like 6 million different services.
Yep.
Are there other services that are also supported by this solution, for instance, DynamoDB or RDS, or even some of the more esoteric ones?
Yeah, good question. So with this current version, we currently only support EC2 and Azure instances. What we're doing with our cloud-based products is about every 3 months, we're releasing new capabilities. So what you're going to see when I show you Azure is Azure's based on our version 1 product. This is our version 2 product. Azure will get an update in the next few weeks. And this allows us to roll out new capabilities very quickly. So whereas a typical on-prem solution, you wait a year, you get the updates, this is dynamically updated. So on our very short-term roadmap is things like RDS support. So as you mentioned, DynamoDB, Aurora, that kind of thing. Also things like VPC backups, where you can go and back up all the configurations of the VPCs and things like that. So yeah, great question. So the first thing I want to show you is our integration from a Veeam platform perspective. So what I showed you there was just Veeam backup for AWS. That's our native backup solution for AWS. But how does it integrate with the Veeam platform? Well, we have this capability in Veeam backup and replication called external repository. And we basically, if we look down here under our backup infrastructure, we add in those S3 and Azure Blob object storage repositories that I was talking about. So these are the ones that you saw over here. If I look at Veeam backup for AWS and I look at my repositories, these are the ones here. So Veeam backup for replication looks at these and says, right, okay, what backups are in there? And you'll see here that all those policies that I had created in Veeam backup for AWS are listed. And there's my Unify controller. So I have the ability with the Veeam platform to just right click on this backup. It's obviously stored in that AWS S3 backup repository. And I can go do things like instant VM recovery to vSphere, where we live stream that data from that object storage repository and mount that directly to a vSphere host. I can also go and do something like a restore to Microsoft Azure. So what's great about this is, say AWS went out completely, you know, chances are slim, but who knows, and my wife's screaming at me about Netflix again, I can go and do a restore to an Azure subscription. So I already have the details entered here. It's really simple. I just go through, I pick what Azure VM size I want. Remember, Azure has a different way to do t-shirt sizing than AWS. I want to say what I want to configure it with. What storage account do I want in Azure? And then I have the ability to go and change the names. So obviously Azure uses less names than, less characters in their names than AWS support. But I also have the ability to pick resource groups. And you're going to see in a minute, I have a backup resource group in Microsoft Azure. And I actually protect that whole resource group through Veeam Backup for Microsoft Azure. I then pick what network I want. So I obviously have all this pre-configured in Microsoft Azure. So I have a backup virtual network. I don't want to assign a public IP to this. And then what security groups I have. So I actually have created one called restored. So there's specific firewall rules for that. I then go through, I can specify that I want to power it on after restoring. So I'm not actually going to do that because it'll take a little bit of time because I have terrible bandwidth. But we can see here, if I look, I did it just before we came to do Cloud Field Day. We can see what happens. So we spin up a little proxy, and then we go and process the actual backup. The whole thing with my terrible bandwidth took 1 hour, 18 minutes to upload a 30 gig instance from my EC2 object storage into Microsoft Azure. We convert that EC2 instance to an Azure VM, and then we go and restore it. So we actually took that backup data from EC2, our object storage, S3 object storage repository, and uploaded it to an Azure environment. If we now look over here at Microsoft Azure, just to show you I'm not hiding anything, we can see here that we have that unified controller. So it's currently stopped. I haven't powered it on, but I've uploaded it. So if I had to restore this to a different cloud, I've just pretty quickly done that so I can get my home network back up and running. Now, I mentioned I put this in a resource group called backups. So if I go to Veeam Backup for Microsoft Azure, you'll notice it looks exactly the same as Veeam Backup for AWS. We have the same configuration steps. You just add in Azure subscriptions, different repositories through Azure Blob Storage, but it's fully aware of what Microsoft Azure is in the same way that Veeam Backup for AWS is fully aware of Azure.
David, if I wanted to roll out all three of these solutions, so I wanted to roll out my AWS, Veeam Backup for AWS, Veeam Backup for Azure, and then
I'm going to come to that.
Veeam Backup for on-prem, is that 3 separate appliances and 3 separate interfaces that I have to work with? Because that seems like, I mean, I know people say single pane of glass and we all laugh at that, but in this case, I might want that.
Yeah, if you can give me about 3 minutes, I'll show you that.
I guess. So, okay.
Yeah. So I'm gonna come to that in about 3 minutes. So what I was showing there is we have that unified controller now automatically backed up. And that's based on, when we look at our policy, you'll see some differences here. We support Azure Active Directory. And when we come to our resources, we actually can add multiple subscriptions, resource groups, or go down to the individual virtual machines. So I have that backup resource group. So as soon as I did that restore of that virtual machine to that resource group, this policy automatically protected it. So from that perspective, the integration with Veeam Backup and Replication as our core platform is very simple with these. But now, to answer that question about the single pane of glass, it does get touted quite a lot. Now, what I'm going to show you here is a preview version of our version 10A update. So this hasn't been released yet. So this is going to support both AWS and Azure. So anyone who has Veeam Backup and Replication, or anyone who wants to have a single managed platform, can deploy Veeam Backup for Veeam Backup and Replication. And under backup infrastructure, much in the same way we add something like a vCenter server, we have the ability to add like EC2 or Azure. Now, this is only going to show you EC2 because it's a pre-release version, but we will support Veeam Backup for Azure as well. So you basically right-click on your managed servers and say, I want to protect my workloads in AWS. You have the ability to either connect to an existing appliance, or you can go and deploy a new appliance automatically. So I'll show you how we do this. You just go through, you already add in your AWS accounts. If you haven't added them, you can simply add in a temporary access key and secret key. You just say, I want to pick this one. You say, what region do I want the appliance to running? So we'll just say, like, for example, Northern California. It connects to that environment. You give it a name. You pick your VPCs. So do I want to pick my default? Do I want to create new ones? What security groups do I want to use? There we go. That's what you always get live demos. I'll just say create a new one. Do I want to use a dynamic IP or a static IP, depending on how you want to configure it? And then you can configure some credentials, so specific username and passwords for that appliance in that environment. That will deploy a Veeam backup for AWS appliance in exactly the same way we have here. But to answer your question about the single pane of glass, what we have now is when we go home, we have our backup jobs. So if I look at this Veeam, where's it gone? So if I look here at this Veeam backup for AWS, this is the one that I deployed automatically through Veeam backup and replication. What we have here is all the backup jobs. So I'm only showing one because this is a pre-release version and it's the same. But we also have the ability to manage our snapshots that we've created and our external repository. So these are our backups as well. Now you'd also see if we had other backups. So if I was backing up stuff in vSphere, you'd see all this listed on the left as well. So when this GAs, you'll be able to have all your Veeam backup for AWS, your Veeam backup for Azure, your vSphere, Nutanix, all your backup copy jobs, all managed through that single pane of glass. So I'm going to switch back to just kind of finish on what we've showed there. Obviously, I've gone through quite a lot in that 35 minutes. We showed the AWS to AWS backups, how we can take an AWS EC2 instance that we're backing up and restoring it to Microsoft Azure. And I also showed you how you could very easily go and restore one of those instances of virtual machines to an on-prem platform. So we did have one more question, so we'll take that question and then I'm going to hand over to Michael Cade.
Yeah, thank you, David. This is Max. So one thing I'd like to understand is about the kind of the appliance deployment topology. Are you deploying one appliance per region, or is there anything specific you need to deploy? I'm not too much familiar with how you implement that.
So it's one appliance, that's all you deploy. So when I was talking about the security aspect, you deploy one appliance into a backup account, and that's it. That will then manage all the regions across all the AWS accounts that you configure. So even if you've got like 20, 30 AWS accounts, multiple regions within those accounts, you just need one appliance.